This is the sixth in my series on the power and psychology of language. It builds on the previous video on hypocrisy, and it's based on some interactions I had on Twitter recently. Bear with me. I'm sure you've seen this play out a number of times. And the sad thing is, originally this video was going to go in one direction, but because, I don't know, something happened where I know I was working at the same time. I was writing a report and I was engaging in a Twitter war with somebody, and I think my radar was off because I should have recognized within seconds after doing a bit of my verbal judo that this person had no interest in actually having a dialogue. But for whatever reason, I misjudged her. I think it's because she did answer some of my questions, and there was just something about it. I'm not sure why, but I thought that there was some recognition on her part that she was being unreasonable, she was being hateful, and she was being extremely ignorant. I really thought that we were going in the right direction. Unfortunately, that's not how it really turned out. So let's take a look at how this calamity occurred, and I hope other people can learn from this. It all began with this opinion piece in the New York Times by Lisa Davis, who was describing her daughter, who is a tomboy. And I don't know if people who were outraged over this article actually read it, or just were jumping on the bandwagon when they saw other people tweeting about it. Because if you read the article, at least on the surface, the mother who wrote it seems to be very trans positive. She wrote things such as, and I quote, "Let's be clear. If my daughter does begin to feel that the gender in her mind and the sex of her body don't match, I will be supportive." And then she describes the specific actions that she would take to help her daughter down that path of self-discovery. She also writes, quote, "I want trans kids to feel free and safe enough to be who they are. I also want adults to have a fluid enough idea of gender roles that a 7-year-old girl can dress like quote-unquote a boy and not be asked by people who know her, not strangers, whether she is one." In the entire piece, her support for her daughter is very clear. The other thing I think is clear is that it is a pro-female and a trans-positive piece. Having said that, I can understand why certain people would be sensitive to or hurt or upset by this article, because if you spent much or your entire life feeling that there's something wrong with you or being told that you shouldn't even exist, then you would be inclined to be defensive when you see something that could be construed as trying to denigrate or deny your existence. I get all that. But having read the entire article, I thought it was written in a respectful manner, and I don't think she was attacking anybody or saying anything bad about any individual person. She was simply saying that my daughter happens to be a girl, she's a tomboy, she's not gender non-conforming, she's gender role non-conforming. And I can understand why trans, non-binary gender, queer, and other people might take offense at even that kind of distinction, because some people say that we shouldn't distinguish between gender non-conforming and gender role non-conforming, that they are the same thing. But not everybody feels that way. Some people feel that when you say gender non-conforming, you are saying that this person is confused about their identity, or they don't want to be placed into a binary system. They don't want to be a boy or a girl. They want to be something else. Whereas many people would take gender role non-conforming to mean that the boy or girl is comfortable as a boy or a girl. They have no doubt about their physical sex or who they are. They simply don't believe in or subscribe to the traditional or stereotypical idea of how a boy or girl should look, or how they should act, or who they should be. It's based on a perspective or a definition that's been around for many years. So why can't Miss Davis say that her daughter has no confusion about being a girl, at least for now? She's just a tomboy, without having all these trans advocates and others jumping all over her. Again, this is another example of hypocrisy, because they are rightfully calling for tolerance, but they are being so intolerant of people who don't use the same language or definitions as they do, even though Ms. Davis is using definitions and terms that have been around for many years. Just because certain people are interpreting her piece as denigrating or denying the existence of trans or genderqueer people doesn't make it so. This is one more example of the language police or thought police coming swooping in and telling us, even though you can't see it, we know exactly what's going on in the minds of this writer. This type of behavior is the height of arrogance, and it's happening more and more frequently, and people are getting sick and tired of it. And I cannot speak about any one individual, but we do know in psychology that when somebody cannot admit to or acknowledge what they consider to be undesirable or unacceptable thoughts, feelings, wishes, urges, or impulses, they disavow themselves of these phenomena and they project it onto other people. That way, they can believe that they are still pure or righteous, yet they see all these terrible things in everybody else. But there's the catch. Those who want to promote their ugly, hateful, divisive, unproductive ideologies claim that if anybody questions them, well, A, they're being hateful themselves, that's projection, and B, they simply can't understand because they don't belong to the right quote-unquote group, or they haven't had the right lived experience. But that's silly because anybody, especially an intelligent, rational, critical thinker, can objectively look at something and say, that is wrong, that's hypocritical, just like I'm going to show in these examples. Now, I don't want to be a hypocrite myself, so I'm not going to assume or impugn the motives of the people I talk about in this story. I am simply going to describe their behaviors. I do sometimes speculate about their motives, but I'm not saying this must be why they're doing it. In any event, it all started when a trans advocate lawyer wrote some nasty tweets about Ms. Davis's articles. This person responded, and after a while I said, look, instead of trying to engage in this conversation 140 characters at a time, let's do it right. Please come onto my podcast. And as you can probably predict, they said no. I also said, just so you know who I am and why I feel this way, please watch some of my videos. And as I'm sure you can predict, not only did they refuse, but they did so in a quite derogatory manner. And then, even though I said nothing objectively wrong, they predictably blocked me. Now here's where the hypocrisy comes in. Somebody who must have been watching this exchange jumps in and says, doesn't this person have the right to their opinion? Of course they do, but by the same token, so do I. Pretty soon it became obvious that she was not interested in actually having a discussion. She had her ideology, she was rigidly adhering to it, while being insulting, making false allegations, and distorting what I was saying. Also, as often happens with certain types of people, she would say things and then refuse to own her words. Nevertheless, I do still stubbornly believe in this idea that no matter how much you might disagree with somebody, if you engage in honest, respectful, logical, and rational discourse, you might be able to get somewhere. At the very least, you can usually make sure that you don't misunderstand each other. So I sincerely invited her onto my podcast, and I also asked her to check out some of my videos so she can get a sense of who I am and why I'm saying these things. And just like with the lawyer, she refused. And that's another example of hypocrisy, because certain types of people claim that they want to try to engage in healthy, productive discussion and try to come to some common ground or some understanding. Yet when given the opportunity to walk the walk rather than just talking the talk, they seem entirely unwilling or unable to do so. Instead, she seemed insistent on maintaining the same inaccurate impression she had formed of me, rather than actually reading the words I wrote or taking a few minutes to listen to my podcast or watch my video. At this point, I finally did what I should have done a while ago, which was to simply disengage. The only good thing to come out of all of this is that when I was trying to look into her Twitter feed to get a better sense of who she is and why she's acting this way, I saw her doing the exact same thing with somebody else, a Mr. Charles Tendell. It was gratifying seeing somebody else on the internet engaging in and trying to promote healthy discourse. Unfortunately, his efforts with this person were as futile as were mine, but we did end up having a very interesting discussion, which I will soon post. In that video, Charles and I discussed the kinds of evasive and other intellectually dishonest and cowardly tactics this person employed, along with her unclear statements and other types of maladaptive communications. To be clear, these videos are not about complaining about some individuals. They're about highlighting the types of unproductive, hypocritical, and destructive interpersonal dynamics that are becoming more and more common these days. We also discussed the fact that in order to make progress in these kinds of discussions, you have to find the courage to be able to confront that which you fear or that which makes you uncomfortable. And unfortunately, too many people these days seem unwilling or unable to do so. In the midst of all this, someone else chimed in and wrote what I thought was a humorous, sarcastic comment mocking the second person. But in reality, they truly believed that I was a mansplaining transphobe. As before, I invited them onto my podcast so we can have a proper discussion about this and they could understand where I'm really coming from and they wouldn't have to make such gross mischaracterizations of who I am and what my intentions are. To this end, I also asked them to listen to 2 or 3 minutes of my podcast where I clearly explain my position. But of course, they declined it over and over. And the hypocrisy keeps shining through because they're presenting themselves as this righteous person Yet they don't seem to realize that self-righteous does not equal righteous. And when you're preaching tolerance or understanding, acceptance, love, peace, whatever else, yet you're acting antithetically to such ideals, that's hypocrisy. It's not productive, it's very destructive, and it's very divisive. And I'm not laying this all on this one person. I'm using them as an example of something that anybody who spent enough time on social media has experienced time and time again. It seems that so few people have the capacity to appreciate or to understand nuance these days, and at the same time, more and more people want to set up these fake boogeymen, whether it's the patriarchy or misogyny, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever it is. Now, I'm not saying those things don't exist. What I am saying is that they seem to want to use the fact that these constructs do exist in some contexts, to some degree, as an excuse for some really reprehensible behaviors. They seem to believe that as long as they can claim to be the victim or the oppressed, or they can identify the person with whom they disagree as the oppressor or the bad guy, then that gives them license to say some pretty vile things. They hurl libelous or slanderous false allegations against the other person with impunity. It's very immature, distasteful, hypocritical, and manipulative. It's like the person who keeps poking at the dog, and when the dog finally has enough and bites them, they whine and complain. But with these people, the dog just has to snarl, and they're going to call for its euthanization. And whether it's deflecting attention away from their own deplorable behavior, or whether it's engaging in the kind of unconscious defense mechanism of projection that I described earlier, the main point is that in their mind at least, they never have to own or take accountability or responsibility for their own words and actions. And that is why I made this series of videos, to help people identify these kinds of tactics so that you don't waste time and energy on people who have no intention of engaging in honest, productive discourse. It's like a game to them. And for those for whom it's not a game, so many of them are carrying around this sense of betrayal, hurt, anger, fear, resentment, impotent rage, and they're just desperately seeking a target at which they can hurl all this negativity because they are consciously or unconsciously trying to disown it. But the reality is, when you feed into all of this negativity and ugliness, it doesn't go away, it just festers even worse. Ironically, I was the hypocrite in this case, because as soon as I realized that my verbal judo wasn't working with this person, I should have called it quits. It should have been obvious to me that they were either unwilling or unable to engage in honest, respectful, civil, and productive discussion. Instead, I tried using their tactics on them to see if I can get a breakthrough. And as I said at the beginning of this video, it seemed like I was making headway, but in reality I wasn't. And the final red flag was when they started throwing multiple memes at me. Now, don't get me wrong, memes can be hilarious and quite effective, but when that's all they've got going for them, I think it's a pretty clear indication that it's game over. Returning to the trans activist lawyer, they subsequently wrote another piece on the internet which was longer and more thoughtful and better articulated their position, but I called into question their stated desire to continue the discussion. Predictably, a number of the usual suspects came thundering in on their white horses, intent on taking down this horrible person because I'm on the wrong side of the issue. But we shouldn't be surprised that people conduct themselves like this, because it seems to be in our DNA, this tribal mentality. The problem is when it gets too far, such as with identity politics, where people are subverting their own individual identity for this group. Not only do you get problems like mob mentality or mob rules and groupthink, but you also end up losing your sense of autonomy, of self-efficacy, of this belief that when I'm alone, I can get things done. Also, with the kinds of people I've been talking about, there's this hypocrisy, because if anyone on the wrong side of their ideology were to do the same thing, that's when they start crying and whining about being attacked and bullied and ganged up on. But of course it's okay when they do it themselves. And they don't seem to understand that they're modeling this disempowering and hypocritical behavior for young, impressionable, weak-minded and or weak-willed people. Fortunately, one out of the couple of dozen people who wrote did have the right perspective. And I appreciate that. And I took that opportunity to further my position as well. It's so important that when these people do these kinds of things, don't get riled up, don't get all angry or distressed or whatever. Just keep stating your opinion. The more you do it, the more there's a chance that at least one person will see the hypocrisy, ugliness, pettiness, small-mindedness, whatever else is going on, and will resist it, and will try to engage with people in the right manner. As a deliciously ironic denouement to this tragic mess, one of my Twitter followers who had been watching this train wreck from the very beginning subsequently noticed that this troll-like person had reached out to Toronto's, or perhaps Canada's, most infamous troll, as you can see in this picture. Before I go any further, I have to be very clear here. When I use the term troll, I'm referring to the behavior of the persona or character behind the Twitter profile, not to the actual person himself. It's a critical distinction because this gentleman has a long history of going after people, making false allegations, trying to get them kicked off of Twitter, and in my case, threatening to make a complaint to my professional college. So I really don't need the hassle. Of course, this is the same kind of tactic employed by one of the people I was talking about earlier in the story. Given that I was saying nothing that could be misconstrued as harassment when she made that statement, one could reasonably infer that perhaps she was saying that as a defense against admitting that she may have made a mistake in the way that she was misjudging me. It does seem hypocritical that somebody who purports to be fighting for tolerance appears to be acting in a way that is very intolerant simply because she does not like what I'm saying. Returning to this so-called troll, we are inextricably linked now because he took this Twitter exchange that we had and put it on Storify. So if anybody ever Googles my name, it's one of the earlier hits that pops up. Perhaps not surprisingly, in the Storify, he didn't show what he was actually saying, so people didn't get to see the ugly, verbally aggressive, and provocative language he was using. Even a cursory review of his Twitter feed reveals his MO, which is to agitate, to use very ugly language, to distort reality, and to make false allegations. And when he gets called out on what he's doing, of course he denies it. Instead, he turns around, plays the victim, cries foul, and threatens to get people kicked off of Twitter. He threatens to sue them for libel or slander. And as he did with me, he threatens to make a complaint to some higher authority. This is like the child who goes around attacking everybody, and as soon as someone retaliates or even stands up to them, they run crying to the teacher or parent or whoever else they believe can take care of business that they cannot do themselves. This is the same thing that happened earlier in the video, albeit in a slightly less direct way. Returning to the Storify gentleman, my mistake was that even though I had no idea who he was, I should have realized very quickly that he was a troll. And as I've said in other videos, when you realize what you're dealing with, just disengage. On Twitter, block him. I didn't, and things got pretty silly. In my admittedly feeble defense, I did get distracted somewhat by a number of people who had jumped into the fray. As mentioned earlier, this tribal or pack mentality is pretty predictable, and it occurred repeatedly throughout this video. In any event, for whatever reason, I continued to interact with him, and I didn't even use my verbal judo. Instead, I tried to play his game, and I took what he would say and turned it around on him. He apparently didn't like that, wrote to my college, and then made this Storify, which is a very biased and twisted account of what actually happened. And as soon as he learns about this video, he will most likely engage in one more act of hypocrisy, which is to turn around and complain to my college yet again. He will most likely claim that I've harmed him in some way by identifying him, which is silly because he's the one who took this story, distorted it completely, and put it on the internet. I'm only commenting on it. And that's the thing, there are so many hypocrites who believe that they can do whatever they want and there should be no accountability. To be clear, I'm not trying to get this individual into any trouble. This story happened a number of years ago. He's only in this video because that other person had roped him in. All I'm trying to do is show what happened so that other people can learn from this experience. So there you go. I really hope that other people at least can learn from this so that it wasn't a colossal waste of my time. We got to get something positive from this. And I do hope that the people who were involved in this, they refused to listen to my podcast just 3 or 4 minutes to realize that they were so wrong about their impressions of me. I hope that maybe they're going to watch this video and maybe they will have some insights and perhaps they will have a positive impact on other people, because if these people can change even a little bit, then some good has happened from all of this.